For a literal year after the initial excitement of our flagmean's death, I had been staring at this fabric from time to time, promptly giving up before I even began to make anything. Maybe because I was still heartbroken over the end of season 1, maybe because this fabric was everywhere for a bit. As many neurodivergent minds already know, the ADHD law of novelty goes thusly. If it's everywhere, it doesn't always spark the dopamine. However, with the most recent announcement that our flagmean's death season 2 was arriving in October, it was finally time. And as Chelsea and I were discussing this challenge in particular, where we decided to make the same tea gown pattern and surprise each other at the end, I started to envision an excellent combination of both the fancy pirate aesthetic and the dramatic Edwardian statement it could definitely prove to be. Both of which involved tassels, of course. The first step was drafting the pattern.
What is this? What? How?
The back panel shape was confusing me, so I started scanning the internet for the images of tea gowns or patterns of tea gowns from the era to see if I could figure this out, and then I started to see something. It was a kind of inverted pleat at the back, which I realized is probably what's going on here.
The most confusing pattern piece. Tell me your secrets.
In 1897, Florence Mary Gardner wrote in The Evolution of Fashion, "The tea gown, on the other hand, drapes the figure loosely, so as to fall in graceful folds, and may be regarded as a distinct economy, as it so often takes the place of a more expensive dress." Economy? Clearly, Florence Mary Gardner was not aware of the cost of a certain directional bird-printed velvet fabric that for a while was barely even available because everyone wanted it so badly. I quickly learned that the 5 or 6 yards I had purchased during this frenzy would not even get me halfway through the construction of this garment, so naturally, I had to order more. For assembly, I decided to mimic the details of Stede Bonnet's robe from the show by adding a band along the front, which is also very common in tea gowns from this time. This meant that I could forego the bolero sort of portion of the original pattern. After having enough fabric to cut out all the pieces, it was then time for sewing them together. And because the fabric was velvet, almost all of my seams had to be hand-basted before sewing with the sewing machine. Velvet has a mind of its own.
Okay, I have sewn the back down to the point where in the pattern it just goes all over the place, and then I have done one inverted pleat and then stitched it down. We're going with it. Okay.
I also decided that I loved the silk at the center front of this tea gown from the John Bright collection, and so this meant purchasing 3 yards of silk taffeta for the center front, and figuring out how to fill the space above the neckline with a yoke and collar, both of which weren't in the original pattern. Luckily, I was able to use the collar and yoke pattern for my Dahlia dress project, altering it so the collar opened with the side seam, which was also where I wanted the closure instead of center front. Or so I thought.
So many snaps? Like, my fingers are gonna hurt.
Tea gowns gained popularity at the end of the 18th century, but also came, like most new fashions, with some people who thought some women were just using them as an excuse to be, I don't know, scandalous. Mostly because they were worn at a time of day when a lady's maid wouldn't be needed, and so the mere thought of a woman being unsupervised for a certain part of the day, in a robe, sometimes without a corset, clearly must have meant she was up to something suspicious. You know, like reading, or being a pirate. It's called relaxing, Edward. In actuality, tea gowns were a comfortable and sometimes fancy outfit for receiving close friends and relatives for tea or dinner, and that sounds amazing. I think Stede Bonnet would agree. The outer portion of the false dress is stitched to an internal, torso-hugging layer of cotton, probably meant to keep everything in place. It was also much easier for me to attach the gathered silk portion of the center front to the lining and the yoke. So here I am covering up the rough bits at the top with, I don't know, a moment of fabric.
Here you can see how this side is just stitched right into the opening for the sleeves, and then like the center front also gets sewn into the side seam here, and then this will cover up this front of the robe part, and it'll look like there's like a full-blown dress here, but there's not. Sneaky.
For the collar portion of the robe, I followed the curve of the pattern pieces. This way it matches the shape perfectly. Then I marked out 3 inches the whole length. And to accent the color, I added a tiny little hand-stitched bit of bias silk from my scraps. Once the seam at the edge was pressed, it was time to hand-tack the bias edging, which involved a lot of weird angles with my elbows. And if you're wondering what those tapes are at the waistline, I have a good answer for you. As has happened from time to time in fashion history, sometimes the trains and bustles get a bit too heavy at the back, and in order to balance out that tugging back, tapes can be used, attached at the side seams, called waist tapes, to pull everything snug to the waistline, especially when the outer garment is not a two-piece and is meant to hang open. It works wonderfully, and it will be covered by the faux belt at the end.
I think this is gonna work. I have just taken like a belt, like the belt from my ball gown, and I pinned it so that it's actually like fitting better. I think I can just lay this on the muslin and then trace it out and I'll have the right shape. I'll change the angle on it just a little bit. Here you can see this is like it's really not hard. It's just 2 layers of muslin. You know, I was able to actually recycle the leftover scraps from my corset, which is really awesome. And then it gets attached. I just attached it to the tape, to the waist tape. It doesn't really need to be secure. It's because it's not holding any weight, right? And then it snaps over here. Voila! I have a belt!
The sleeves in this Stede Bonnet costume are meant to be a men's shirt from the early 18th century, and hence the lacy sleeve ruffles. To make the sleeves in this tea gown, I had to make 2 sleeves. The first would be the robe fabric, the other would mimic the shirt, and it was easy enough to do by simply adding a ruffle and scallop lace to the ends of the cotton sleeve. I decided to add a pinked ruffle to the skirt of the underdress just because I'm not adding a heavy velvet ruffle to the outer layer, and it makes it look just a little bit more full because I guess Edwardian seamstresses were trying to save a bit of fabric. I just wish they hadn't done it there. The good news is that this meant I had less to hem. I did not add a lining, which I will probably regret, but at this point, so much fuzz was coming off of this thing that it was getting into my nose, and I just wanted to be done already. And finally, after all the hemming, which wasn't that much economy, it was time to add the tassels. The best part. It's done! Time to take aesthetic shots in front of the fireplace. Only issue was, I don't have one. I promise you that I didn't just buy this for the video, but it's perfect timing. There was something about Stede Bonnet, who didn't want to sacrifice his tastes and love of fashion to pursue his other interests, that I think is why I loved his character so much.
Wow! That's a lot of snaps.
Maybe that's not how other pirates do it, but why couldn't he? Why not put a functional fireplace on an entirely flammable vessel? He does eventually give up and lose his material possessions, but I like to think that maybe his tastes and interests will come back. Once he realizes he doesn't need to be like other people to be happy. I hope he sees his own strengths and who he is already, that they were always there. And I hope season 2 is as amazing as we all have been hoping for. This was such a great challenge, and I'm pleased with the results. Also, be on the lookout for the construction video of Chelsea's gorgeous tea gown, which I will link at the end, and stay tuned for the next video where we show the moment we revealed our gowns to each other. It's pretty cute. Cheers, my salty possums. Until next time.